share directly?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Thanks. How's
Yeah,
that?
I can see. Yeah, it's perfect. Can see that.
Good. Thanks, Callum. Morning, everybody. Hopefully this won't overlap what Callum has just said too much. I think I anticipated some of what you were going to speak about. Yes, thanks for having me. And yeah, we're very pleased to be supporting ERSA as one of our infrastructure fund bodies, of which there are several more. We're also supporting other grantees to deliver interventions directly, and that's kind of starting now and over the next few months. And we are in the process of commissioning high quality evaluations of all of those interventions too. So it's a very busy time at the moment at Youth Futures Foundation, and we'll be sharing the fruits of that labour with you and our other stakeholders as soon as we can. But for now, there's kind of three parts to this presentation, and I'll probably pause at the end of each, the first two parts for any questions, just so that we can remember what I've said, and I can remember what I've said before we move on to the next one. So firstly, I'll be talking about, as Callum hinted at, some findings from research that was done for us by Tony Wilson and colleagues at the Institute for Employment Studies, and this was looking at the unequal impact of the pandemic on young people's job prospects. And the report came out, I think, in February. I'll post a link in the chat once I've finished speaking. Secondly, a quick introduction to our approach to building the evidence base and identifying what works. So alongside the evaluations that I mentioned just a moment ago, we're also looking at what evidence there is from around the world that can help us understand what works and build that into useful formats that people like yourselves and other stakeholders and policymakers and employers can use to improve outcomes for young people. So I'll speak a bit about where we're at on that front as well. And then the third area is a quick overview of our policy approach and some of the recommendations that we've been thinking about, and Callum alluded to some of those that we've been working with through the Youth Employment Group to ignite change for young people from marginalised backgrounds. That's our kind of overall goal as an organisation. So firstly, looking at some of the impacts of the pandemic, and as Callum has said already, young people have borne the brunt of this jobs crisis, kind of as they always do. And there's a quadruple whammy hitting them at the moment. So firstly, they are far more likely to be changing jobs or entering the jobs market. So between 600 and 800,000 education leavers a year. So when that happens, obviously they're hit by the hiring freezes that are happening. So that's a kind of very sort of structural, cyclical effect that's affecting young people. Young people are more likely to lose their jobs in slowdowns. So the last in, first out principle around redundancy policies, more likely to be temporary employees in the first place. So kind of less attached to the labour market initially. Thirdly, the first lockdown hit just as the summer recruitment was starting. So there was a kind of perfect storm in terms of the combination of those factors. We're obviously entering another summer period fairly soon, and we're hopefully in a different position by June than we were last year. And then fourthly, the youth-rich sectors have been hit hardest by the pandemic and the lockdown: hospitality, retail, entry-level administration. Again, Callum alluded to some of that in the statistical overview. So I'll go into some of those in a bit more detail. So again, from the stats that came out last week, this is showing that of the total change, the overall fall in the number of employees on payroll, so this is through the HMRC payroll data, young people are still accounting for more than half of the overall fall in the number of employees. And you know, if you shift up your definition of young people slightly higher, looking at the under 35s, it's obviously an even bigger chunk of the overall fall. So there's a real concentration there in the numbers of job losses affecting young people. I think that's something that is pretty well established now, but in the latest data that's continuing, and they do continue to update the information that these stats are based on each month. So you can't quite rely on these until you get the latest data, because the payroll information is coming through to employers all the time, presumably. And those figures are despite, when you look further back in lockdown 1, 2 in 5 of young people being away from jobs or on reduced hours through furlough during that period. So you've got the proportion of employees not working normally by age back in last June, and there you can see a sort of peak for that 16 to 24 group of around, as I say, around 40%. So the fact that those two things are operating together gives you a sense of the kind of colossal impact on the youth labour market. Then turning to another source of information for understanding what's happening to young people. This is the total number of people on young people aged 6 to 24 on universal credit back from December up to the latest figures in February. So you've got the numbers there. You can see the big spike in April as the lockdown hit, and then there's the share of those who are in work and on UC and out of work and on UC. So the out of work component is generally bigger, but you'll see from the middle of last year, most of the growth was actually in young people who are on universal credit, but also in employment. Now, we don't know if that is because young people were moving from being out of work into low hours or very low paid work that kept them on universal credit whilst they were in work, or they were already in work and reduced their hours, but then came under the threshold to be able to claim universal credit. So the dynamics of how this is changing is actually a lot more complex underneath these figures. And we've seen in the very latest set of data a bit of a turn in that trend of rising in work universal credit claims. So the out of work groups started to grow a little bit more, and those in work have started to shrink. And again, the reasons for that could be the reverse of those drivers that I mentioned before. But still very high numbers indeed, nearly 1 million young people on universal credit. And again, kind of alludes to some of this in terms of what kinds of young people are losing their jobs fastest. And this is some research from the IS study that shows the falls in employment during the crisis, with the average pre-crisis have been 4 times and 3 times greater for Black and Asian young people, respectively. So here you've just got the percentage point changes for employment, unemployment, and inactivity for each of those broad ethnic groups: white, Black, Asian, Chinese, and other. So the blue line there for Black groups is showing a percentage point change of over 5 percentage points, and for Asian nearly 4 percentage points, compared to about 1 for white. So that gives you your kind of ratios in the headline there. So there's quite a distinct impact by ethnicity when you look at the changes pre and during the crisis, which I think is really important, thinking about the kinds of support we're going to need for young people as we emerge from the third lockdown. And again, breaking that down by region shows quite an interesting and different pattern. So here you've got the same kind of average employment rates for young people pre-crisis in the blue, and then the yellow bar is showing the employment rate during the crisis. So some regions you've seen an increase in employment during the crisis, so particularly in the north and Northern Ireland, and declines where you've got the yellow bar smaller than the blue bar for particularly in the south. So that the report kind of digs into this a little bit to try and explain why this is happening, and it's probably to do with the different sectoral combinations in different regions. So there has been growth in public sector employment in some regions that's kind of helped in the north, and the decline in other sectors, particularly kind of tourism hitting the southwest, for example, has affected those regions differently for young people. So there's an interaction there of the kind of sectoral composition of the region and the proportions of young people that are working in those sectors. So again, it's really important to be aware of this when thinking about how to direct support and funds that kind of help young people kind of come out of this crisis more positively. Then again, another feature around the kind of more marginalised groups of young people is showing kind of pretty sharp deterioration in their opportunities. So here we've got the percentage of those unemployed, of those who are unemployed, the percentage that have been unemployed for more than 6 months. So this is a kind of measure among the unemployed of those who are going into much longer term unemployment. So you've got the dotted line there, the orange line for the 16, 17-year-olds, very small numbers there, just that normal caveat. But for the 18 to 24 group, particularly since the middle of last year, you've got a doubling in the proportion of those who are unemployed for more than 6 months, up from around 20% to 40% in the latest stats. So that's a real warning sign that already we're seeing quite stark rises in long-term unemployment for young people. So also, as Callum has said, it's mainly the sectoral drivers that have been creating impacts on young people in particular so far, but also some of the other factors I mentioned right at the beginning. The unemployment outlook is definitely uncertain, but perhaps not as bad as originally feared. So the latest OBR forecast is for around 6.5% overall in the economy, and if things stay as they have been in the past, then we may be looking at around 3 times that rate for young people, maybe 18, even 20%. But we need to keep a careful eye on what's happening to see whether those predictions are emerging or not. But more importantly, already the impacts we're seeing have been greater for young people from marginalised backgrounds, and we've got rising long-term unemployment, and now it's just ticked over 250,000 young people overall who have been unemployed for more than 6 months. So the focus has to be on those marginalised young people, that is from ethnic minority groups with low qualifications, disabled young people with physical or mental health problems, young parents, care leavers, those in contact with the criminal justice system with more complex overlapping needs. So that's really where our focus as an organisation is turning right now. So I'll just pause there for a moment to see if there's any questions, either in the chat or if you want to put your hand up. Can't see any so far. So there's one from Deborah. Do the stats indicate levels of educational attainment? Deborah, do you just want to sort of flesh that out a bit in person? If you're there. I don't know if she is. Okay, shall I carry on with the rest of the presentation?
Yeah, go for it, Chris. Okay,
so, well, maybe there'll be some questions at the end. If you want to make a note and store them up, that'd be great. So, the Youth Futures Foundation approach to what works. So here is what some people call the evidence architecture, the pyramid of doom for how we're approaching building the evidence base around youth employment. So this is a way of thinking about how we go from kind of raw data and primary research about what's happening to young people and what interventions are being done, to thinking about synthesizing, analyzing, summarizing, curating, and translating that into useful checklists, guidelines, or toolkits that enable decision makers, practitioners, employers, policymakers to kind of have their decision making informed without the need to reading all that original research. So we see our role as a kind of broker between that raw data and those evaluation studies and people like yourselves that need to know how to do it, what can be done, what's useful from this evidence base. So we're working across that whole pyramid to think about how to build useful toolkits and so on for people to use. So there is an existing review of all the interventions that have attempted to help young people to get into work globally from the year 1990 up to the year 2014. And there were only 100 studies that kind of fit into that category of being really robust quality evaluations that had some kind of control group where you could be sure that the intervention was doing something above and beyond what would happen in any case. And what this map has done is categorize the different kinds of interventions they found into these three broad categories. I'm sure these will be familiar to you all, but it's quite useful to see how that global evidence stacks up. So we've got one category around strengthening training and education systems, another around enhancing labour markets, and a third that they've called transforming financial sector markets. So the first one is kind of the bread and butter of employment support, so training, upskilling, retraining, vocational interventions, internships, apprenticeships, life skills training, and support to enter work more directly, so mentoring, careers advice, intermediate labour markets, wage subsidies. So you've got the whole range of different kinds of interventions there around training and education. And then a bit more on the demand side, probably more around government policy. You've got evaluations of decent work policies around labour standards, or around provision of social security and work incentives and so on. And then also looking at kind of purely information giving, so around labour market information or campaigns and marketing. And then the third the third category is around entrepreneurship, promotion and financing. So that's microfinance, grants for setting up businesses, or crowdfunding to do the same. That third category is very much in kind of low and middle income countries in terms of the number of studies there. But I think it's quite an interesting potential gap for us to think about in the UK in terms of interventions and evaluations. And then the other axis of the map is outcomes. So again, these, based on what they found, have been categorised into these 5 areas. So firstly, economic outcomes, then education and skills outcomes, entrepreneurship outcomes, employment outcomes, and broader welfare outcomes. So for economic, you've got things like cost-benefit analysis, studies looking at spillover effects where you're intervening in a particular area, but then it has spillover effects into surrounding areas, or looking at the cost of interventions. Outcomes around skill levels in terms of technical skills, digital skills, or qualifications. Entrepreneurship is around outcomes in terms of actual business and job creation and the performance of those businesses themselves. Employment, hours, job quality, earnings, and welfare is kind of thinking about those broader societal outcomes like crime, citizenship, inclusion, and probably health and well-being would sit under that category too. So when you put those two dimensions together, you get your interventions and outcome map. And this is a kind of very high-level summary of what that looks like in terms of the number of studies that have been found in different categories. We've also mapped our own interventions that I mentioned earlier in terms of what we're supporting against that with the numbers and the plus signs there against the bigger bubbles that show the worldwide studies. So you've got a real focus there on employment outcomes from training and skills interventions, and I think that's probably what we'd expect. And to some extent, Youth Futures Foundation's own interventions mirror the wider evidence base to a large extent. For decent work policies, because that is mainly government interventions, you wouldn't expect us to be kind of working directly in that space, and information by itself broadly is not that effective. So again, not an area you would expect to see more studies in, but probably the gap really is around entrepreneurship. So it'd be really interesting actually to get your thoughts on how far self-employment and entrepreneurship is part of the landscape in terms of the young people you're working with, or the schemes that you've encountered from government before, new enterprise allowance and so on. That seems to be a gap in our understanding as well as our practice personally and in the wider evidence base. So as well as mapping it out, they've also synthesized the results from those studies. So the overall conclusion is that youth employment programs report statistically significant positive effects on average, which is good because they could have found that they didn't make a difference. But that size of the effect is pretty small. So that 0.04 translates into, say, if you had a control group that weren't getting intervention, they say 50% of those got a job after 12 months, whereas your intervention group would have job outcomes of 55%. So 5 percentage points difference is kind of the ballpark of what impact overall those interventions are having. Now, it's a very wide range of interventions across a long period of time in lots of different countries. So this is like the highest level kind of statistic that you could have. So just to bear that in mind. And only around 1 in 3 of the evaluations were positive in that the young people having the intervention got better outcomes and were statistically significantly better than the control group. So that's just a bit of a sobering reminder that a lot of interventions are not found to be better than kind of control interventions or the background effects. And we also see much bigger impacts in low and middle income countries because the overall rate of skills, levels of skills and education is kind of on average lower. So there's kind of more to play with than in countries like ourselves where the general average level of education is kind of a lot higher. That sort of the headroom there for improvements is a bit smaller. So what actually works from this approach? So what they did in the study was to look at those positive impacts and then pull out the elements of programs that were related to those positive findings. And they've come up with these 7 sort of broad categories of interventions that seem to be associated with better outcomes. Be really interested in your thoughts on this list. So firstly, adding complementary services to the main delivery. So what that means is making sure there's a menu of options for young people to choose from when they come into a service. And I think that's probably something from my observations of the kinds of things that you all deliver and other organisations deliver. That seems to be an accepted approach. Making sure there's good profiling to assess degrees of need from kind of minimal to the most disadvantaged, and kind of 1 and 2 there are clearly connected elements of good programs. Ensuring participants stay in the programme, that's kind of obvious but really essential. Interesting, payment by results was found to be associated with better outcomes, as was involving all 3 of the public, private and third sectors. The 6 areas around tracking impacts over the longer term, because generally where they are significant, they accrue and grow over time. And then the 7th is focusing more on disadvantaged young people. So I should have said that the map itself covers interventions with all young people, no matter whether they're disadvantaged or not. Obviously, they're disadvantaged in the sense that they may not have a job, but there's very little focus on, say, ethnic minority young people or young people with low qualifications. But maybe associated with the finding around bigger results for lower and middle income countries. If you're focusing your interventions on young people who need it most, the impacts can be better and bigger. So what are we doing next? We want to get this map up on our website so that people can kind of search it and use it to see where the gaps are and see where the evidence is for backing up or not for different interventions. We're also investing in writing kind of easy read summaries for each study in the map because as I'm sure you'll know, a lot of abstracts in academic journals are not very easy to follow, so we want to make sure that this is kind of understandable to ourselves as well as the users of the map. We're also doing a new review of studies, evaluations of implementation and process. So the initial map is outcome studies only, so it's looking at effectiveness, not implementation, but there's a huge amount of learning we can get from those kind of evaluation studies too. Somewhat bizarrely, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs are doing an update of that synthesis. So we already know that since 2014, when that first study was done, there's another 300 high quality studies, and there's probably more that have been published in the last year. So the quality of that evidence base has kind of grown exponentially since that first study. We're trying to find an in with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. If anyone's got a contact there, that'll be useful to know. We're also doing more reviews on promising approaches and pressing problems. So within that map, you can kind of dive down to do a more in-depth review to get more fine-grained and useful information to build toolkits and useful outputs for users from that. And that's really what we want to do next, and test that out with people such as yourselves to make sure that they are actually useful in practice. So that's the end of part 2. Just pause again. See if there's any questions or any comments. What did people think about that list of what works criteria? Did that ring a bell, or was there anything missing or surprising? Okay, I'll take silence as complete acceptance that everything I say is correct in that case. So I'll press on with the last part of the presentation. It's just a few slides about kind of how we're thinking about government policy and the response to this crisis, using both the analysis of what's happening right now to young people, but also our kind of growing understanding of the evidence base about what's effective. So we all know there are big policy challenges when it comes to youth employment. There's a policy fragmentation across central government. So responsibility for policy is spread across many departments: DWP, DFE, Treasury, DCMS, BEIS, housing, communities and local government, arguably too. And there are kind of faulty connections with other policy areas. So when you think about welfare and benefits policy, in its broadest sense, young people's needs and the design of benefits for young people are a bit of an afterthought, and I would say kind of driven by quite outdated and macro assumptions that are causing a lot of hardship as a result of that. Similarly, when you're thinking about industrial strategy, levelling up the various funds that are coming online, thinking about where youth employment specifically fits within that, again, is not kind of front and foremost in the documents and the thinking that is available to us. There's also a disconnection between national and local government that we all know about, as well as the kind of the links in between, the combined authorities, the LEPs, you know, thinking about that landscape of the geography of policy in terms of youth employment is really complex. It's confusing for employers, practitioners, and for young people themselves who are trying to navigate both the fragmentation from central government that means DFE and DWP might be kind of telling them slightly different things at the same time, and that disconnection between national and local government, which has the same effect. And it's kind of not really clear that young people's perspectives are really kind of embedded and shaping policy design, and that's something we as an organisation really want to do ourselves, but also support that within policy making. So more specifically, we, as I said, in terms of the analysis of the problem, as well as findings from the evidence base, we really want to focus interventions on young people from marginalised backgrounds. So that breaks down into 3 areas. So what we'd like government to be saying is, for instance, in September, all young people leaving education will have the opportunity to take up a training, qualification or a job, but really making that opportunity a guarantee. So having quite hard indicators and hard outcomes that young people are not left out. That focus on long-term unemployment really has to happen now. So again, we want government to be saying things like no young person should spend more than 6 months unemployed without access to a meaningful opportunity or education opportunity. So again, making that hard line there that long-term unemployment does not go beyond that point. And coordinating that needs some work too. So breaking down and kind of joining up those schisms in government and with local government, we think should be coordinated from number 10, Cabinet Office, maybe even Treasury, so that there's a cross-government and cross-sector approach to reducing long-term unemployment. So we think commitment to those 3 things would give a framework then for the many policies that sit beneath that, and making sure that they are working towards delivering good outcomes rather than this slightly confusing mass of different initiatives that young people, employers and practitioners find it hard to navigate. So that is it from me for now. I'm very happy to share the slides in the best way, but I'll take advice from ERSA on doing that later. Just checking if there's any hands up or questions. Don't think so. So not sure where we're at with the timings. Maybe Callum or Elizabeth could advise on what next.